Coming to you live, but not really. It is all pomp and no circumstance with Ryder Richards on LetUsThinkAboutIt.com, the amateur hour you should never tune into.
Hello, this week we are talking with Jason Szeftel. He runs a podcast called China Unraveled. So really, China is still anathema to me in many ways. And this conversation is one way for me to learn a little bit more, right? They're sort of authoritarian and capitalist in a weird way, but they frequently, of course, limit information by shutting off the internet or portions of the internet. And of course, yet during the pandemic, we also saw how reliant we are on them for so many of the commodities and for production of commodities, right? So, of course, Jason and I end up discussing how we should consider them since they don't really play by our rules. And they don't even seem to care that much about human rights violations. So what do we do? I mean, because economically, what does our world look like if we cut ourselves off from them? Hello, this is Ryder Richards with Let Us Think About It. We have a special guest today. This is Jason Szeftel, and he's based out of Los Angeles area out in California, so slightly different time zones from us, but we're going to have a little conversation today and talk mostly about how the state of the world as it involves China and sort of the differences between Western cultures, Eastern cultures, and then how this plays out on sort of a grander scheme, especially when we start involving things like the economy and different kind of cultural looks at how the world should be shaped. So, Jason, do you want to give us a little bit of background about, I guess, how you got interested in China and maybe some insight into what we're going to be talking about today?
Hey, yeah, I'm really happy to be here and to talk about this. I think it should be really interesting for everybody. And so I'll give a little bit of background on me. I've been into China basically for maybe around 20 years. And it really started when the United States started 9/11 hit, it started invading Afghanistan, and then there was Iraq. And there was just this sense that we were getting embroiled in all these different conflicts all over the world without any ability to resolve them. It was sort of like Vietnam, but we were sort of being the global police, as that old movie said, the old animated movie. And so I'd been into China for years, and then around 2010, I first went to China. I learned the language. I got a scholarship to study there. I was in Beijing. I went all around the country, and I continued to learn. I focused on law, development, economics for years, and I sort of developed a knowledge base and a good understanding of this country. And I have a podcast where I've been talking about specific topics that came up when the pandemic started. And then but over the last 2 years, I've been putting everything together into a book to really give people a comprehensive sense about what China is about, how to contextualize all the information we're hearing about it, and how to figure out what the sort of conflict we're seeing or the impending conflict between the West or the United States and China is going to look like and what it will mean for people. That's what I've really tried to do, and I hope I can share some of it right now.
Yeah, so you've mentioned, and let's just start off with the big one, the impending conflict. This has been something that I've read a couple of articles, or at least I read the headlines, right? That, that it eventually America and China are going to butt heads even more strongly than they have already, and that it will lead to some sort of escalation. So what do you see that looking like? And then maybe you can sort of back up and talk to us about how we got into this situation.
Sure. So I'll back up first. I think that there's always a potential for a real conflict, but China has a lot of problems within the country and directly around the country, and the United States is ultimately very far away. And China's main thing is just to keep the United States push it out as far as it can, push it away from China's sort of main, primary area. So a lot of its military strategy is about anti-access and area denial sort of abilities. It wants to keep the United States out of the Western Pacific, out of the South China Sea, and stuff like that. But China's real problem is it's maybe for the last 1,000 years, China has been struggling to integrate its sort of wealthy coastal regions, which are connected to the outside world, which depend on foreign imports, foreign energy, external markets, exports. So those are the main export hubs that really powered China's recent rise, and just integrating that with the rest of the country and dealing with all of these other countries and powers all around its periphery. So Japan was its historic enemy. Originally, before Japan was sort of invading and colonizing China, it was actually like some of the world's best pirates, and they were just plundering the entire Chinese coast for hundreds of years. And that has been a real challenge. So China had sealed itself off for hundreds of years. They actually created something called a sea ban, where they literally did not allow any Chinese people to go out to sea or to return if they did. And that was starting in the 1300s. This has been a really long process. And what we kind of see is just China opens up to the world. It opens up these ports. It needs this foreign capital. It lets these ideas come in, and then it starts to threaten the integrity of China, and it closes it back down again. And you see this opening and closing again, this process for really the last 1,000 years again and again. And what we saw in the 1970s was the most recent opening. So it's opened up again. It's got all the new money, resources, and everything came in. And then it started to create all sorts of tensions, economic tensions within China, social tensions, which we could talk about Hong Kong and sort of a perfect example of sort of that encapsulated in China. And these are the real things that China is worried about. Every country has a grand strategy, wants to take over the world. Like everyone has on paper this idea, but sometimes you just have to deal with the real problems, like the sort of more mundane things around you. And that's what China's really focused about. So when the United States and China, people talk about how there's going to be this big conflict, the way it will probably play out is just China trying to deal with these real challenges sort of internally and immediately in its local area. And so the United States being allied with Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea is the prime thing that China is really thinking about, because that is sort of integrating the United States in with all of these nearby sort of historic enemies, rivals, and stuff like that. And that's sort of how it will play out. So will there be this sort of great military conflict between the two countries? To be honest, it seems unlikely. China's military hasn't had any sort of combat operations since 1979. It hasn't ever secured the airspace over any country. It has never done a joint combined operation with multiple military services. It doesn't actually train its military with sort of realistic scenarios and simulations. And the people's the military, the people's armed police, the people's the Navy, the People's Liberation Army, all of that is really a political organization as well. And so it's really it's enmeshed with the government in a lot of ways that doesn't exactly lead to the sort of military we see with the United States, which is this expeditionary military that can go out all around the world. And I'm not trying to minimize its enormous gains. Like the Chinese military is really improving in a lot of ways, but China is very hesitant to use this military because if it messes up, for example, if it fails to capture Taiwan, which is what the entire military has been geared towards since it started to modernize in the 1990s, that is an enormous blow to the Chinese government, like something from which it probably wouldn't have the political legitimacy to recover from. So there's real challenges, and that is so if people are worried about how this conflict might occur, Taiwan is the great thing to talk about how that might play out, how the U.S. might respond, because that's a local thing where the U.S. would sort of insert itself. And that's what China really fears. That's why it has these giant anti-access area denial capabilities to try and convince the U.S., hey, it's not worth it. If we're attacking Taiwan, don't get near. You won't be able to do anything. It'll be too much of a blow. Don't bother. Let us do our thing. It's our country anyway, et cetera, et cetera.
Wow. Yeah, this sounds great. I mean, it's also sort of fascinating to think about. There's several other countries that have done this, right? They build a military for a sort of a singular purpose or something like that. And the idea that what used to be a military that maybe had, I don't know, as you said, more of a political or a symbolic function, it's kind of fascinating to see them gearing up and moving towards some other kind of ideas and trying to play and open up this kind of world scale larger. There's something about that. If you want to close off your borders and go back into nationalism to control your ideas, then I think a lot of us could say, well, that's okay. Go ahead and do that. But it is interesting whenever that starts looking outwards into this kind of expansion.
Yeah, and so that's the real thing. So China's built an enormous civil society now, right? It has 600 plus major cities. It's an entirely integrated international sort of national infrastructure. And this has made it extremely powerful, but also very fragile. And normally, if a country just wants to be, if you want to be isolationist like Mao was, that's fine to do if you have everything you need to work at like a subsistence poverty level of life within your borders. But now China really, really depends on foreign imports. And this is something that people often don't hear just in the media and just in general. We talk about how, oh my God, the US is so dependent on so many foreign supplies and things, which is true in a lot of ways. But China has the same thing. It's the major importer of a host of the greatest, largest importer of a host of minerals, metals, semiconductors, farm products, fertilizers, pesticides, all of this stuff. And in fact, if there were sort of disruptions internally within China, there's a lot of supplies that the entire global export market doesn't have enough to like feed China if all of it went to China. So that's the challenge. And that's also the challenge with currencies. Like everyone, we hear a lot about currencies and cryptocurrencies and stuff. And if we had a theoretical country that was just, it didn't trade with other countries, it was all domestic currency, you could really balance out a currency pretty easily. It's when you have other countries buying your currency and taking it, and there's financial markets and speculative operations going on, that's when it's really hard to manage. And when you need a lot of imports, when you need a lot of different things from a lot of different countries, it also really challenges your currency. So China has extremely strict controls on it, and it's very hard to see a way that it can pull itself fully back and maintain the integrity of both its supply chains, its sort of infrastructures and needed materials, as well as its actual currency. So it's a real challenge to see how it might do that.
Yeah, no, and this is, of course, they've also been doing some interesting things as far as gaining mineral rights and, of course, building factories that make the rest of us really reliant on them. One of the conversations lately is about Biden's green bill, right? So that we're supposed to go by 2025, have all these green vehicles and move into energy systems that would require a lot of battery uses and rare earth magnets and things like that. But as far as I understand from production levels, rare earth magnets are pretty much just a Chinese thing. Like we just don't have the supply set up. And same with batteries. I think we have like 3 battery factories in the US that are capable of lithium ion production, while China has something like 40. And of course, their plans are to double or triple their battery producing capabilities. And even if America doubles or triples ours, we still can't hold a candle to them. So then we have this import export imbalance, which normally, if we are in a global society and we have imbalances and we have strengths and weaknesses and we use those for each other in a globalist society. So what we end up, I think, kind of running into there is maybe the differences between the two societies are causing tensions where we no longer can sort of trust each other, or we're afraid of each other. And that would be a different role for America, right? Is to go from being, as you've mentioned, with kind of this world police into being somebody who has to be frightened of another country.
Yeah, I think you really hit something really important there. We have a global system where we have separate centers of consumption and production. So China right now, I think it's something the UN recently put out, it's about 30% of all manufactured goods are from China. So we're getting close to a third of all production. It's huge. It's enormous. It is the largest concentration of industrial capacity the world's ever seen, and probably will ever see, to be honest, because it is, like you said, it is trying to supply the entire world. And so when you hear about things like China's Belt and Road Initiative and all these foreign initiatives, like you said, to secure mineral rights, a lot of what China is also doing is it needs to maintain employment, and it needs to maintain, again, its currency. So a lot of the way it gets back currencies by these enormous exports. It balances its system out, and it's actually trying to export all of this production. And what you actually see is overproduction within China, right? So solar panels, all these industries it was able to dominate, it did it in part by getting a massive scale. But like you said, so something like rare earth metals, it's actually not something that's rare at all. There's rare earth metals everywhere, but it's the processing and production of it, which is extremely environmentally toxic in a lot of ways, or it's very expensive to make it not toxic. So in China, where you have lax environmental regulations, lax labor regulations, you just get enormous amounts of this. And you see that the places in China where you get a concentration of the solar panel industry, for example, a lot of the polysilicon comes from Xinjiang, which has basically slave labor, forced labor to produce all this, zero concern for environmental controls. And it allows them to gain these super dominant positions in a host of industries. And that didn't matter to the United States very much until this, like you're saying, well, what if things renationalize in certain ways? What if after COVID, people want their own, personal protective equipment built, produced in their country? You want vaccines produced in your country. Or for new industries like electric vehicles, you want to ensure the entire supply chain is also built in your country. What do you do? And you're really right that there's a change in the United States, but there's also a change for China, because it means that it can't actually, if you renationalize, this overproduction can no longer be, exported to other countries. So what it'll have is a massive glut of every conceivable product you can imagine, basically. Yeah. And that's extremely, it's terrible. It's extremely terrifying for the Chinese party in its own way. So there really is some sort of economic incentive for both sides to say, hey, the United States, yeah, we do want everything back in our country, but it takes a while to do that. Maybe, Biden and Trump are both renational. Like Biden is more nationalist and like economic nationalist than Trump was, at least in terms of actions. Minus tariffs, like there's a lot of other ways it's happening. And you're seeing actually a continuity in that, but it still takes a while to sort of change these global supply chains that have been building since the 1980s, and trying to figure out what to do when China isn't quite allowed into the game in the same way, or where things are just shifting, the perceptions are shifting and the economic realities are shifting. It's really up in the air. Like there is no one in the United States government right now who has a strong plan that they're implementing to make this work. It is something that is going to be piecemeal worked out over the next 10 years. And I think anyone watching American politics and seeing the melodrama should know that instinctively, but it is good to just say it. And the places where you're going to see the action happening is to look at very specific industries and the actors and players in those industries and see the decisions they're making. Where are they locating production facilities? What are the cost structures of the different labor? A really big thing in China right now is both labor and energy prices are really going up in China. And that's been happening for the last at least 8 years. And it's really impacting a lot of different industries. And it's coming at the same time as certain things in the United States, particularly in Texas, shale oil and the cost of natural gas is really changing the economic calculus for a host of industrial facilities. And you're seeing a real transformation there. And a lot of what we're seeing with COVID and what we're seeing with this renationalization, deglobalization is just changing the calculus quicker than our politicians or even the way our media is talking about it is really prepared to process.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point, that everything is happening on, it seems like, a ramped up speed or ramped up scale. And yeah, this closing down and renationalizing and going back and forth between these things, and then figuring out how to set up long-term globalized relationships is also difficult when you're dealing with a country that has lots of different kind of, let's call them just human rights violations, right? So we go into something like the G7 or some sort of summit, right? And we're trying to all talk about things and agree on different things. And of course, we can talk about the economy as one thing, but of course, we also don't like the idea of trading with somebody who has these surveillance capitalist states, and they, intern the Uyghurs, and we start getting into these things. Not only that, but the way they treat their labor force, and all of a sudden, what is your cheap T-shirt actually worth?
Yeah.
If we start looking at, if you get into ideas of utilitarianism and, large scale happiness across the globe, yet we still want our cheap goods. And so,
Yeah.
There's these sort of ideas about how those are going to merge, which sort of moves us maybe more into a political realm. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that, the terrible thing, there are certain basic facts about the global economic system, regardless of if it's based in centered in China right now or if it's not. And so when you see production moving out of China, unless the production, in textiles or other industries where the technologies are good enough that you can use automated systems, a couple advanced workers to be more productive than, say, a Bangladeshi, shirt factory or something, you can start to bring things more towards developed countries. But in general, you're not going to see like a moral revolution in this system. Unfortunately, if it leaves China, some of these facilities in production, it's going to go to Vietnam. It's going to go to other countries where you're not going to be happy with the labor situation there. And that's not we could definitely go into Xinjiang, to the Uyghurs, to the situation there, and to the extreme degradation and deprivation that was involved in a lot of the Chinese industrial rise. But I just think that we shouldn't pretend like there's going to be some sort of moral revolution accompanying this. And it's really one of the terrible things. Like I want to give people a sense of the actual complexities of this. So just as an example, in China, Tibet and Xinjiang, the two Western provinces in China, they both have historic minority peoples, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, and everyone's very concerned with what's been going on there for decades. And when I was in Tibet many years ago, you can walk through, you'll be walking through an old city in old streets, very cool in Lhasa, and you'll be in an alleyway, or you'll be in a street, and there'll just be like a checkpoint like you see in a TSA airport, an airport security. You'll just be in the middle of a street. You'll have to take off all your stuff and you kind of move through, and you'll be monitored all around. And what we're seeing with the level of intrusive surveillance and monitoring in China is reaching insane proportions. So what I saw many years ago is almost nothing compared to what they're doing now with the way they're collecting collecting data. And to give people just a bit of context for that, this is a way, this way to manipulate and observe and control behavior en masse is sort of a way of, you could think of it as a way of lowering the cost, the per capita cost of authoritarian control, right? If you get people to internalize what's going on, if you have automated systems that can manipulate and direct behavior in the way that you want, you're really actually lowering the cost of managing a massive authoritarian state that is becoming more and more repressive. It actually is a bizarre economic calculus going on, but it's, if these, let's say a place like Xinjiang or Tibet were actually to become an independent country, we've had this illusion since probably the 1950s in the United States, when the CIA was very heavily involved in trying to make that happen, particularly in Tibet, that it would be a happy, peaceful place. It would not. The Tibet and Xinjiang would be immensely, would be poor and impoverished and miserable. That's just a fact. It's not, I'm not trying to say it's better that they're with China, but this idea that there's a better road, a better place for them to go is really a fiction. Like this denationalization, this deglobalization, globalization was what enabled small countries that might have had a certain resource they could fit into the skill, the stack of supply of production and skills. So very low skilled places, they could at least slot themselves into the global supply chains or whatever it happened to be. If that's kind of breaking down as well, a place like Tibet or Xinjiang would have almost no ability to integrate with anything. And the fact that they're landlocked makes it even tougher. So the places that, if things start to deglobalize in certain ways, places that are coastal but independent, places like Southeast Asia, like northern South America, these are places that could actually sort of reintegrate into more localized, more regional supply chains, whatever that looks like. But this idea that it's a bit of a tangent for people, but it's just, this is these complexities I was talking about, where we're thinking, hey, if China cracks up, breaks in different pieces, which is one possibility, is that better for everybody involved? I mean, no, it ends up in terrible chaos. And it's not worse, it's not bad, but what are the options? Tyranny or chaos? This is the basic option in Chinese history, and it really hasn't changed.
Well, and they've been in power. I mean, they're just, I guess the Qin or Han dynasty it was back in 220 BC or something. So they've sort of, as a nation state, have been around forever. And really have not, while there have been challenges to their power, they seem to have, held it together for such a long period of time as a civilization. And, especially when you get into some of the kind of Confucian ideas or how their society functions, then it maybe has a completely different framework than what we have, right? Which is, at least in the United States, like, we show up and kick some butt, and a couple hundred years later, we still think we're butt kickers, right? Like that's kind of how we do it. So, but this idea that they have been around for that period of time and have remained in power with all these people underneath them, and that kind of tyranny or chaos, but the idea that they have somehow maintained the tyranny or authoritarian state or whatever you want to call it for this amount of time, it just really messes with my head. It's hard to get around.
This is the thing, and I really, in the sort of the book I'm revising and hoping to publish at the end of this year, it really goes into the depths of the different pieces of China, how they fit together, how they were integrated, how they developed and came together or didn't come together over time. Because the idea is China is 1.4 billion people around, and there are pieces of China that are larger, that have more people than all of Western Europe, than the East Coast of the United States, and these really are distinct regions with their own histories. And so what a lot of people are told about Chinese history is not true. It is a work of narrative art produced by state propaganda over basically thousands of years. So you really pointed out China, its first moment of unity, true unity, did occur in 221 BC was when the main core region of China first came together, and that was when it really actually just began its journey towards being a unified people. This was really a process, even in this core region, which is the North China Plain, which is you can basically think of this region. It's a region in northern China that is the size of about California or Japan or Germany. The entire thing. Germany is a good example. It's the size of Germany, just in the middle of China, big flat plains region. And Beijing is at the northern part of it. There's Shanghai is sort of at the southeast, and this ancient capital of Xi'an is in the west, and sort of a triangle connecting these three regions. But in this region, this core, it actually took them hundreds and hundreds of years and many rounds of war and political struggle to actually integrate this into one region. So just to give people some context for, chaos, tyranny, the stuff I was saying before 221 BC, China, this North China plain, experienced some of the most intense and unrelenting warfare like humanity has ever seen. And this region, the North China plain, is probably the bloodiest battlefield anywhere on Earth, because China has been around for so long and it struggled to unify for so long that the only places that even compare in terms of the level of violence and bloodshed that you saw in these political struggles is probably the Ganges plain, which didn't probably have as much, although it's also old, parts of Mesopotamia, and then the North European plain, where Germany, France, and they're all kind of lined up there. But before 221 BC, China experienced basically 550 years of continuous warfare and over 1,000 wars. So just that's almost hard for people to process. But 550 years is double the length of the entire history of the United States.
Yeah.
So it's enormous. And this process of really integrating this region together took hundreds of years, and it really wasn't complete until at least 1000 BC. It was probably in the Ming Dynasty, starting in the 1400s, that it really was officially one sort of unit, because it's just, we get into this, but the actual dynamics on the ground within China produce a lot of disunity, a lot of division, a lot of disorder. And what the Chinese Communist Party, and a good thing for people to know, is that what we see with the Chinese Communist Party, what's needed to govern China is a totalitarian state. And whether it happened to be the Communist Party or if it happened to be the nationalist government in Taiwan, if they had one, what we're seeing, the sort of totalitarian government, this isn't something that where a change in political regime, like we think about in the West, like, hey, let's make Iraq a democracy. And you look at Iraq, it's like, hey, it isn't a democracy. Let's try and make Russia a democracy. Hey, since the 1990s, it has not looked like a democracy, and it probably won't ever. There are ways that you have to govern different countries based on the reality on the ground. And that's something that we can easily forget when China is so big, so complex, and so old. And there's so much propaganda that the Chinese government is trying to sell to itself and to its people that we've absorbed, that makes it very hard to think this through, sort of in the way it really happened.
No, this makes a lot of sense. I've been reading some Baudrillard lately, and simulacra, assimilation, all these kind of things. But these kind of ideas that we do tell ourselves stories, and then we at some point lose the actual reference, and we assume that these stories are real. And from then on, we are just basically enacting false stories, but they're actually a kind of a residue of a larger story that happened sometime in the past. And if we can't sort of reconnect those things and find some sort of meaning or purpose within them that is somehow deeper, then we're sort of destined to just enacting motions. And when we're doing that, everything becomes theatricality. And so there are some moments in Chinese history where I think that kind of theatricality has been showing up. And of course, that comes back into propaganda. And it seems like in the last 40, 50 years, this has been something that's been showing up for almost every nation, including the United States.
Yeah, there might be something just about the world we live in, the media, the way we're creating our national identity, the same way we all struggle to create our own individual identities and develop our personalities and display it and sort of internalize and sort of have it agreed to and seen by people the way you want to see. Nations are really involved in the same process. We have more nations today than we've ever had. They appeared and they were allowed to form. They were allowed to survive a lot because of the system that we've developed since 1945. But a place like China, I think you're really right that it's been telling itself a story for at least 2,200 years from them. And I really do believe that the story of China, if we actually learn the actual story and not what we're being told, there's a real story. This is one of humanity's great civilizations. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. But the actual story is not what we've been told. And I think the lessons that Americans or Western people can take from it is probably different from what we think. So one of the things, there is a meta narrative and sort of a master narrative in Chinese history that I could get into if we wanted to, but it's very inspiring. It's a hero narrative about how to defeat just endlessly recurring forces of disorder and division and chaos. And it's very inspiring. And I've actually sort of graphed it to give an overarching meta narrative for what Chinese history looks like, and a way to sort of move ourselves away from the getting caught in the details of some random dynasty, some random period. It just seems to go on forever and ever and ever. You can sort of get a bird's eye view, a view from 30,000 feet to see what things look like. But it's hard. I mean, I think that every country is really struggling to find out this narrative. I mean, I think we're all worried about, like, so what is the actual history of the United States? What is its actual future? And there's something about how the history we want to believe sort of informs the future. It sort of informs where we're going to go with it. And it's a real challenge. It really is just a media battle. It's a battle of dueling narratives, or, you know, that's kind of what we see.
Yeah, there's something that, you know, after, of course, World War I and then into World War II, there's, I guess, this whole postmodern movement of philosophy came out where that ended up becoming deconstructionist. And part of that was to pull us away from these sort of grand narratives, because we ended up seeing world wars based off of these kind of large ideological struggles. So sometimes there does seem to be like a sort of toxicity that can be formed whenever everyone believes one thing and they move one direction, right? So the unity and the idea of keeping something united can actually lead to a lot of harms and problems. Of course, so we've been constantly working to deconstruct everything now. Now we end up with a whole bunch of individuals. Yet what we're finding is the romance of that large narrative seems to be coming back in a lot of areas. People are now you know, more and more interested in having a common voice or a common movement forward. And so they're joining sides and they're choosing sides. And there's also sort of this romance of violence that is showing back up again. And that's been sort of fascinating to see, because it's also paired, you know, on both the right and left. There seems to be stronger and stronger movements going on. And they are leaning more into this sort of polarity. And so when we're starting to talk about things like, I don't know, tyranny or chaos or something like that, there are people, and their entire vision is to sort of create a utopic world. And this utopic world at some point has to essentially solve all the problems of production. It has to solve all the problems of these other things that are human rights violations and things like this. And I really just can't see China playing well in this world. I don't see Russia playing well in this world. And so there does need to be this kind of resetting of how we're going to figure out how to move into the future together if we're going to kind of continue with this globalization. So I think these, of course, are huge problems. And of course, I'm not versed enough in any of them to even have any kind of recommendations in that regard.
Yeah.
But this idea of this sort of meta narrative is, I think, really fascinating to me. So that was a long way of me just talking around this idea to get back to this meta narrative.
Yeah, no, it is really fascinating. And I think talking about deconstruction, the movement in sort of when deconstruction becomes a primary intellectual movement, right? It's, you know, it used to be called structure. You know, there's post-structuralists before it was like the deconstructionalists. And the structuralists, it's really interesting that the structuralists in anthropology, in sociology, in politics, and all these different domains, they were actually trying to create grand narratives. I mean, they were trying to create master theories, grand narratives, all that, and basically all of them failed. And I think what kind of one cut I've taken at that I think is really helpful is somewhere around the 1970s, there was a flight from the complexity of the world. All these theories failed. And whether you're looking in gender, in politics, in economics, and all these areas, and you see the actual complexity of the world is reduced. We sort of retreat to different, more small stories. Like, we didn't replace grand stories with something, we just replaced them with sort of small stories in a very weird way. That, you know, we moved away from this complexity of the world. And I think that one of the lessons to take from that is just maybe theory isn't where you start, right? I think everyone says, oh, I have a grand theory. It's like, then you immediately try and do something with it, or try and say, it's like, oh, I have a grand theory about China. And then you go look at anything in Chinese history. It's like, that doesn't fit. Well, what do I do now? It's like, well, maybe you don't start with these theories in the way, then put all of your emotional energy and intellectual, I don't know, pride or something in them. You just have to be constantly dealing with reality and sort of engaging with it. And I think that one thing I see a lot is, one of the hardest places to deal with is just economics in general, like what we've been talking about with this deglobalization, with globalization or deglobalization, whatever's been happening. One of the challenges is, like you said, you have to sort of deal with the idea of production and sort of increasing livelihoods around the world. But what do you do when the means, I guess the means of production, to use that phrase, are evolving constantly, and there are new technologies, and it's actually the people who are in the academia and in the ivory towers, they're so far away from all this that we're still dealing with abstractions. In the political realm, we talk about neoliberalism, neoconservatism, all that kind of stuff that is really decades out of date from the way that things are actually happening. And there are no master movements in any of these fields either. You're actually just seeing this inability to even coordinate people around ideas. And so when you say that people are, you know, circling again around ideas about power that are associated with, you know, power, I think it is really true. And power, I think the part of the movement towards deconstruction and all that is power is dangerous. It makes, it leads to war and all that, but we're also, a lot of things lead to war. There's been war forever. I think the scale of war and the potential damage we saw in World War I and World War II it was frightening to everybody. And but the modernist movement to sort of create these grand ideas, these grand narratives, these grand systems is really still with us. And I'll just give a quick cut on that. We can get back to that meta narrative. But one of the things we really saw after World War II was the end of the era of total war. So it used to be you'd mobilize an entire society. So we still have draft laws and all of that. And they basically all went away. The United States, from 1970 to 2000, developed a professional army and a non-conscript army or military. And we said the introduction of technology really changed the way that nations go to war. So the U.S. is able to basically lose in Vietnam, win in, I guess, the first Iraq war, and then sort of just muddle along in the Middle East for decades. And it doesn't actually didn't even impact interest rates in this country. There's at least in the most recent one. So it's a very different situation. But what we do see is that there's fragility in all of the different systems that society runs on. So you don't actually have to, throw bodies at each other. It's like the U.S. and China aren't going to throw millions of bodies against each other in the Pacific, but you have these vulnerability of your food supply systems, your infrastructure systems, your energy systems, your data systems. All these basic things are extremely vulnerable. And so it is, again, this idea that the war is changing, the means of violence are changing, the means of production are changing. All of this is happening, and it's so rapid that you really have to be somehow engaged with it you have to have the right ideas and theories and kind of be really working with what you're getting all the time. And I think it's just very hard today, as a last quick cut, is just that we don't have the sort of foreign news that we used to have. I think this is something that your audience should really, really take to heart, is that starting in 2000, we basically lost. We just all the news organizations just started excising, just getting rid of all of their foreign divisions. And you basically, by 2021, we don't have a group of foreign correspondents or people that have been in these countries and actually learning. There's no knowledge wasn't really passed on. There's no new generation of journalists that are coming in to inform us about different parts of the world. So it's just extremely difficult to even get a handle on things. And if you read a random New York Times article about something in China or something in whatever, it's going to be so drained of the necessary context and the necessary background that it really won't help you. And it's really a scary thing.
Yeah, no, this is, when you were talking about the models and, it goes back to that territory map confusion, right? Is that
such a great line.
Yeah,
yeah. He doesn't need anything else in history. Anything he did, you just have one of the best lines ever. But go on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's so fun to kind of just come back to this idea of like, what is reality? What are we living in? And of course, this becomes the other issue with journalism is, of course, we're reliant on these journalists to feed back a version of reality to us. And increasingly, if we don't have any basis in reality, and yet we're only reading the journalism, right? We're only watching it, then we're only seeing scripted versions. And I think we are at a point where we know that these are scripted versions. We know that all news is scripted. We know that almost every piece of information is coming from a bias and from a certain source. So there is this kind of idea that if you want to, overcome ignorance, read a book. If you want to overcome sort of racism, then go travel. And these ideas that if you want to talk about anything, you actually have to go out into the world and do them.
Yeah.
So there has sort of been a reduction of that in a lot of regards. At least that's one of the things that I kind of continually seem to bump into is very few people do more than read the headlines. I think as we were chatting earlier on, we were talking about like, well, I read a headline that said X, Y, and Z, right?
Exactly.
And there becomes this model of consumption that even the shallowness is almost too much, right? Like we're not going to sink any real time or energy into anything because there's too much coming at us. So we're just skimming headlines. And even if you read the full article, you did more than most people, and that's good enough. And so there has been this kind of trend in that direction to not actually get to the reality.
Yeah. I think there's also something where this information, if you're just taking it in, it really doesn't do much. I think you really need to be in a conversation or a debate about it. So if we live in a world where many areas of debate are shut down, or you have to take all these pre-fashioned positions, and which is what you see in the news. It's like, well, I got exactly the expected cut on this topic, and here's like the 3 stock answers, et cetera, the positions that everyone has to believe. It actually prevents you from doing the sort of back and forth engagement with people that actually gets you to think about these ideas and this information, because otherwise it's just in the ether. It's like, oh, wait, I read something about Darfur recently, and what is your? I don't think that information really is going to sit anywhere. It has to be emotionally relevant. It has to be, and the easiest way to do that is just to be in an argument with someone. And so I think something like what you're doing, these podcasts, where it actually gets people to think about things and to discuss them, and it's actually very important because you need that engagement with this information to make it stick, to make it meaningful, and to mull it over in your head and to bring it up with people. And also just to find people who you feel like you can be open with and actually say what you believe, because otherwise you don't know if you believe terrible things or like actually bad ideas. Not like you're a morally bad person, but like it's worse to just be absolutely wrong. Wrong. And like you've been wandering around like, oh, I thought that was like the way the world works. I guess no, it's not even close. Like
no, this
funny
is
thing.
Well, you mentioned having a podcast, that I ended up sort of starting mine because I just felt like I wasn't having any conversations. And so I was like, well, I'm just going to create like an artificial class for myself to just start reading things and sort of the idea that you have to teach the things that you read, right? So you have to like process them and dig through them. And then I get to sort of spit them out in these formats. Yet just recently I've started doing these interviews. And the fun thing about the interviews is, as I say these ideas out loud to somebody else, I just go, you don't even know what you're talking about, dude. Right. Like, and I'm thinking this like all the time. And I think maybe that place of doubt is probably a good place to be, but increasingly, I don't know if anyone wants that, right? Everyone is really anxious to have facts and to have a position and to have a stance and to never look like a hypocrite, right? But yet we should always be falsifying ourselves and looking at these alternate claims and saying, yeah, I need to be learning from that. Every time you feel that pain of being wrong, that's probably a good thing, because maybe you can grow from that.
Yeah, I mean, also, I think that the feeling of being vulnerable and exposed and having our idiotic ideas kind of out in the open and challenged, it's uncomfortable, but it's really the only way if you know your ideas are any good. And I think you really hit the nail on the head. You have to put it up to debate, see if it's any good. Like if I came here and I was talking about China and as I was speaking, it made no sense to me and be like, well, okay, that'd be a sign. Maybe I should, wait a little bit. But no, I think that's really where you really learn. And I agree. So I started this podcast, China Unraveled podcast, basically when the pandemic hit. I was basically revising this book, and it's the entire picture of China and what's going on and where things are going. And I realized, okay, dude, instead of burying all this, why don't I just talk about some of it and make it relevant to people as sort of these major issues just continue to escalate and cascade with China. So there's issues with Hong Kong. There's issues with what's going on with the pandemic. What actually happened? What started? How did that play out? Just basic things about, how China works. You could kind of get a sense of how that probably happened. And I just thought I was just trying to get it out there. What's funny is I actually started to go, I went so in depth with things that I did a 3-part series on Hong Kong to give people a whole sense of the trajectory of Hong Kong. It's about an hour long. And I realized after that, I was thinking like, hey, I got to finish this book. If I keep doing these sort of things, it'll just never get done. So I'm actually kind of I'm trying to figure out what the best way to get, the information that I'm trying to get out in a more manageable way. Cause I want to give people the full picture. I'm very into not just presenting my expert opinion on something. It's like I'd much rather give people the tools that are lacking these days. Like what if I give people the framework and the general way of going about to look at, even if you just get a headline, maybe you can put it into the right context to know kind of what it means in the scheme of things. Like that's the harder thing to do. Kind of the more valuable, in my opinion, when we live in this world of unmanageable information, decontextualized, infinite decontextualized information, right? That's emotionally useless, but overwhelming. So that's kind of the thought. But I really am trying to think about what to do with the podcast next.
No, I've actually started a book too that I wrote while I was in Japan in 2019, and that sort of led into this. Originally, everything was about sort of DIY, and it was sort of this notion of taking the rebellious spirit of DIY, sort of the personal gumption that it takes, and then sort of moving forward with that into a realm of politics, right? So there's this sort of interesting way in which it incorporates capitalism into itself, but trying to find some way that maybe it could actually refute it at the same time. And of course, the whole podcast is DIY. It's me reading stuff. It's me talking about things, right? And whatever. And so, but this kind of entering into almost in a sort of Socrates, Plato way, entering into this kind of philosopher kingdom where not being a physical warrior, but sort of being somebody who's a philosophical warrior, where you're after ideas, where you're chasing things down, where you're trying to figure it out, right? Where you're trying to find some version of truth. And so I was sort of writing this text, and then of course everyone that, if you write the book, and maybe listeners will be interested in this, maybe they won't, but everyone told me you have to have X number of followers on various social media platforms, and the only way to get there is to do something like a podcast or to do some other kind of thing like that. So ended up making forms of media to end up publishing a form of media eventually, right? So
Yeah.
you end up getting caught in these kind of circular loops of always producing content. And once again, we're just feeding into this fire hose of ideas that are just blasting everybody all the time. Like, so we're trying to, like, interestingly enough, like, what do you do with something like silence? You know, what do you do whenever you're getting blasted with all these ideas all the time? How do you ever suss out anything that's meaningful? How do you pay attention to certain conversations? This is also sort of a unilateral asynchronous communication style that we're doing right now. And I am kind of interested in the idea of bridging that gap. But another part of me just realizes that that's not scalable. And the idea that we can even talk about scalability as far as communication goes is very strange. And this takes me all the way back around to China and thinking of their kind of 1984 system of propaganda and indoctrination. And until the people are always anxious, but always pumped up with sort of vigor and anxiety, right? Through the information they're getting. And that very much kind of reminds me of, you know, a lot of dystopic sci-fi that I have read previously.
Yeah, I mean, you really nailed it. There's something about, you know, us producing content, and there's this weird circular thing to it where it can sort of lead to itself, and it just feels like it's part of the flood. The great thing about it, though, is that there is an authentic voice, like you said, sort of trying as best as it can to look for truth in whatever sense it's going for. I think when you look at China, that is actually the super dangerous thing that is trying to be tamped down as much as possible. And just to give people a context for what censorship in China looks like, it is, I mean, in many ways, I mean, a great example to go back to Xinjiang, where the level of, this is the testing ground. It's been the testing ground for all the forms of social controls that are coming out and slowly en masse to China. What they have there is biometric data on every Uyghur. So you have your blood, your blood, your eye, your thumb, your fingerprints, all of that. But it goes much deeper. They also have your gait analysis, so they know exactly how you walk. So if you're going around, and I mean, if you have a mask on, and, you know, they actually identify you through a number of correlated means. And the most recent thing they're actually working on is actually emotional. They're going to be able to read emotions through just AI will be able to read emotions through facial expressions. So you're starting to be able to correlate. Oh, look, this guy looks angry as he's walking up to a building. Maybe we should stop him. And you have everything. Every text you've ever sent, every communication, everywhere you've ever been, geolocate everyone you've talked to, a map of all your connections around the world. It is extreme. There's really nothing like it. And this.
Oh, can I interrupt just for a second? Sure. Yeah, I bumped into something where in Target, the store, they had figured out that your gait would dictate whether or not you were stealing. Your body posture changes around your gait. And so this is sort of fascinating, but also the emotional thing is fascinating. And then the counter options to that, where people, like, for facial recognition blocking, if you paint your face like a juggalo, like, you know, then all of a sudden, then you have like, there's something about it thinks that the stripe across the face is your chin. And so it distorts the character recognition. So there have been like instances of people trying to block or alter this, which is also fascinating because we're getting to see the sort of the counter to the technology, at least here in America. Of course, over there, I doubt they allow for any of that. It's just at another level.
Yeah, what they saw. So when the Hong Kong protests were going on in 2019 and 2020, there was they used laser lights to get in, because there's cameras everywhere in China. So they're also correlating, you know, your behavior, your location, and seeing feeding it all through constant surveillance. And so they were just kind of blinding them and blinding drones and stuff. But it is limited. And you're really right that a lot of these you just have enough data. You're starting to see they're just spotting patterns. The engineers and researchers are just seeing the patterns. And in China, you're just seeing that information, you know, monopolized in you know, sort of put through the coercive state mechanisms on a mass scale. But we are seeing that in the US by just companies. I mean, a lot of things that we think are, a lot of advertising, a lot of market data, a lot of demographic stuff is really being fed through this stuff. And we're seeing, creepy versions of this here as well. So it is a good point. I was going to mention the biometric stuff and how they're us looking for, truth on podcasts and stuff. So what you see in China is like, hey, these guys had a great conversation. Looks very authentic and awesome. It's gone from the internet. It's just gone. Like text can disappear, and you can lose access to the internet, and then a police officer just shows up in your apartment. It's crazy. And so a lot of people in the U.S. are very interested in like anonymity in Bitcoin for cryptocurrencies for those purposes, for blockchain and all this, but it is really interesting to see how all of these technologies for anonymity, which actually the U.S. government is starting to really not see in the best light with the way it's associated with money laundering, drug dealing and stuff like that. In China, it's a huge threat. I mean, it's like this terrible, amorphous, anonymous group of people who don't like the state. It's like, that is like a nightmare. They're just like, I'm not even going to let it start. So
yeah, which is really cracking me up too. Whenever on occasion, I'll hear somebody going on about how this is going to replace the current currency and this, that, and the other. And I was like, there have been several instances in history where people have, the leadership has come in and taken over all the money again. Like even Roosevelt asked for all the gold back from people, right? So you would get into these things even when we were on the gold standard of the state just declaring it all then belonged to them, right? Like all your base are ours, or whatever the thing is, and they just come in and they just grab everything. And so this idea that somehow cryptocurrency is going to survive that or supersede that and become something else, it's very utopic, and I like the idea of it. I can see how Ethereum could work out pretty well in that regard, but as far as having like just because it's a operational language, but when we start getting further into these things, I consider quite a bit that yes, all these things are threats, and increasingly with this technology at people's disposal, then this becomes the other option, right? It's almost like we have enacted the sci-fi world that we were told not to. Oh, wait, you could control people? Well, let's control them. Oh, you can do this? Well, then let's do that, right? And so there starts to become this idea where we have these fighting ideologies again about what it means to be alive or what it means to live in certain regards. And of course, we'd be kind of remiss if we didn't bring up Foucault at some point with this whole panopticon and the madness of civilization and the idea of the discourse and being the normative training, which you've already mentioned. If people do internalize these kind of behaviors, or they never knew that option existed, then we are right back into kind of an odd slave state, where everyone is a serf that's only fed certain pieces of information. And this is something that they've kind of started doing in Russia by controlling the media, is making sure that your government is always seen as competent. And that's one of the things that China does very well, is they show off their competence and very much ignore any failures.
Right. Yeah, it's a huge thing. There's a sort of a secret language being spoken between China, the Chinese state, and the Chinese government and the Chinese people, and is very much concerned with the government trying to show it as competent and has everything under control, and using as much propaganda to try and convince the people that that's the case, and actually doing it. The Chinese government, it has a lot of problems. I'm the first person to really go into all of them, but on a lot of functional levels, it is very competent. I mean, I think that the ability to execute, it's very different. There's a very different legal system. Not even a legal system there, but it's a very different world. But the ability to execute what it did, I think a lot of people are very impressed with the level of execution that Communist parties managed to successfully do. People were saying in the late 1990s, China's doomed. Middle of the early 2000s, totally going to fuck it. It's totally going to mess up. Totally going to go fail. In the late 2000s, it's not going to survive the financial crisis, but it really has. It has pushed forward in all these ways. And I think what we're talking about, of all the new digital tools, the ability to control, to use data, to correlate all these decisions, it is empowering the government in a lot of ways. And when you're talking about crypto and all these Bitcoin, I think it is, like you said, it seems to be containing a lot of the emotional energy and enthusiasm for some sense of liberation from these corporate control, from bureaucratic state control. It does seem to have a lot of this utopic sort of energy behind it. Will it pull out, will it lead? I mean, I think there's the funny thing about crypto is there's this combination of like truly brilliant idealists and like total hustlers, like just side by side, like they'll be in the same conversation.
Oh, that's
some will
so
be
funny.
some will be so like sometimes like the actual idealists are like weird. You're like, they're the ones who seem weird. They're not like super verbally adept, and they're like maybe a little socially awkward. And then the hustlers are like smoothest con guys ever. You think they're just absolutely brilliant. This is really the future. And you actually, you can't actually separate it. But I think we really should never forget the coercive power of the state, right? We may think our government is incredibly incompetent, which is true in a lot of ways, and it's just useless and can't do basic things. The politics is just a giant pathetic melodrama that never ends. But there is a major coercive power to the state, and you see that in a place like China. So will Bitcoin ever become what it needs? I mean, I think it's going to have a real role. I mean, I think in Central America, like El Salvador, I think was the one that first allowed Bitcoin as legal tender, and it's going to help it with remittances, where a lot of countries, from the Philippines to Mexico to a lot of places, they get money from developed countries, and it's sort of sent back to the families of the people who work there, and it's a major source of income. And if you can remove a lot of fees and do these sort of transactions with low cost, high volume, it could do a lot. But will it replace a lot of other things? I don't know. It's very cool. I encourage everyone who's really into it and is in the honest, authentic, idealist side and working to create cool things. Please continue. I wish the hustlers would, I don't know, like, I wish their NFTs would fail or something. But but I really do believe there's a lot of good that can come from these technologies. I hope they're developed further. So.
No, I agree as well. It might be a way to. It is fascinating. The only way maybe to get out of the localized problems of the nation states is to devoid all nation states, right? Which would be a super fascinating utopic idea, in the way that you would eventually get rid of all race and all money, and we would just move beyond all these things, right? There are these kind of ideas out there that could exist. I don't know, maybe they couldn't exist. But there are true radicals and idealists out there that have fascinating ideas, and I'm trying to dig these people up and stumble across them and just seeing how what they're working on might work into a potential future. The fascinating thing is a lot of the futures end up talking about basically the idea of us being sort of adolescents in a lot of things, that we have never really gotten to the adult stage of actually being able to say, give back to the ecology, give back to Earth. We've just been taking forever, right? So whenever you sort of bump into these kind of things, then of course China's growth, anyone's growth, becomes dependent on a constant usage and taking from something else for these means of production. And that means of production sort of being a utopic future that of course will inevitably crush our planet. So the idea that we would have to move beyond that would require us to somehow blend globally all of our goals together or our desires together into something else. And if that requires a currency that is something like crypto to get us all speaking the same language and thinking the same thing, well, that's super cool. But it's also, from what I hear, like NFTs, to make one of them, it takes like all of the energy from the state of Maine. It's kind of they require a ton of resources to use and burn up. And so this is just one more level of production that we get ourselves caught into.
Yeah, what's funny about a lot of the energy, I mean, it's a good point, the energy requirements of a lot of crypto. It's really funny that a lot of that production, I mean, a lot of the mining is happening actually in Xinjiang in China, of all places. I think it's something like 70% of all Bitcoin mining comes from there. And we know this because I think a dam failed or something failed, and an enormous percentage of mining on Earth just cut out. So it's, again, it has low cost of production, very cheap energy, typically coal, and it's moving to this place. And also Bitcoin's being used for capital flight out of China. So it's not like, hey, like I'm trying to do this thing. It's actually like, how do I flee my country, which doesn't protect my property, doesn't protect my resources, and go to another system that does. So I actually worked for a while in global, it was associated with the UN. I did a project where it was developing, it was global standards. It was involved with trying to create systems of global coordination, global administration. And I will encourage people I don't want to say this is a completely hopeless thing, but the mechanisms we use to coordinate the world over the last since 1945, a lot of them were these indirect means of just the way production was regionalized, security was brought to a lot of countries, and we had economic coordination mechanisms and all this. Anyone who thinks that it's just a single currency is going to do it, I think is underselling the scale of the problem. And especially just people in China, they want so many rich people in China just trying to get their money to Canada, to any like sort of former British Commonwealth country. And I think that trying to pretend like there's huge problems with the nation state, but the bigger problem, I think a bigger problem is just that we actually have so many failing nation states that maybe we're not willing to acknowledge that yet. Ones that we're actually never able to actually go through the nation state formation process in the first place. A lot of the Middle East never went through it. A lot of Eastern Europe really never went through it. Most of Africa really never went through it. So I don't think we're going to see any sort of utopic vision. I think it's actually going to be, the places that will have the best capacity to implement all of these new technologies are probably going to be the ones with the most durable and resilient nation states in the first place. Although it challenges it in many respects, it also there's not even reliable energy in a lot of Africa. They're not going to to rely on these sorts of things. It's a very tough thing to imagine, and especially when a lot of these places are just trying to get some form of political consolidation and political continuity to basically even create a baseline for a continuous society. It seems very hard. Again, I think it's one of those things we were talking about earlier, where the complexity of the world, we've been retreating from the complexity of the world because it's all of our grand Nixon's Kissinger's grand ability to like do some global strategic chess, all that like went away. Yeah. It all failed. And we don't have the ability to think, oh, here's a mechanism that could do it all. So I think we're kind of coming back again to, hey, maybe this one currency thing could do it. Well, probably almost certainly not. But we're reducing things again because the actual complexity of things is crushing in a lot of ways. We don't have the time, but again, I think like we said, at least it's putting the energy to some sort of good use, like the energy as in people's intellectual and motive, not the actual mining for Bitcoin.
No, right. Yeah. No, and it is that kind of vision of digging and thinking and looking, and I really can't consider any of that curiosity to be a negative. I would really hope that that's something that we bring out. I find that sometimes school can drain people of that kind of curiosity, and hopefully we are starting to do the reverse and, open the world back up into that digging and thinking, and we can do things in reductive states just to get by from day to day. But maybe when it comes to our ideologies and belief systems, having a little bit more time to develop those would probably be quite healthy.
Yeah. And I think another thing you mentioned, that a lot of what we're doing these days seems to be extracting value rather than creating it. So in a lot of ways, maybe what we've been doing in the US since the 1980s, outside of maybe computer science and information technology, is we've been financializing a lot of the country, consolidating different industries into quasi oligopolies. A lot of what it's doing is just extracting value from these industries without really creating it. And often we're sort of pillaging the old cultural institutions and moral resources, or whatever you want to look at in our society, to sort of keep things going without actually creating and producing a lot of new value. And I think it's a real interesting way to sort of look at it. I think with Bitcoin, it seems like it's actually creating something new, or crypto, it's creating something new, where this idea that we're just going to just keep, bankers, hedge funds and private equity will just like grab industries and restructure the capital, and then like voila, value's created. It's like, well, maybe actual new things.
Yeah, you're actually doing the opposite. You're extracting rent from the actual economy just to move things around. And this is increasing. What is it? Something like 80% of the financial sector, they say, doesn't produce anything. They just move money around, and that's 80% of the wealth. And so you start finding that there's these, I guess Richard Sennett talks about it, and then Jack Allen, moral mazes. And you have a couple of these guys who will talk a lot about how this restructuring is based off of Protestant work ethic values, which of course are they're sort of championed as a front, like a propaganda, but the actual values that are driving everything underneath them are completely different. And so increasingly we're seeing that kind of fragmentation, and people are recognizing it. And the issue is, if you do want something that's truthful or real that you can rely on and put your energies into and move forward on, there does need to be something there, right? If you want to find purpose. And so there are people whose entire jobs now is just helping other people find their purpose. And this becomes as another commodification of all things. So it's not to circle around that too much because it could get dark, but Yeah, I'm very excited to have you on the call, and I'm super super excited to get to see the book at some point. So
Yeah.
whenever you get it published and get everything rocking on that, I think I would, man, let me know. Love to buy it, love to dig through it, and yeah, it's been fantastic talking with you. Before we exit, is there anything else that you want to discuss?
Yeah, I don't know. I think we covered a lot. It was interesting. We got into a much more abstract and philosophical place, which I think was really great. And we talked about some of the new technologies, new things maybe to be excited about, but maybe to be wary of. Got a perspective on how China is, pursuing a very different direction. So I think that it was really good. I can give, if people are interested in sort of more of what I have to say, there's you can check out this China Unraveled podcast. There's 11 episodes, and there'll be more coming out on it. But I'm trying to get the book for you and others who actually want more of the full picture. Like that was my goal, is that people who want, like, hey, I could just dig into the entire thing, get the full perspective, mull it over, see what's good, toss what's useless. That's sort of the goal. And I'm putting up some YouTube videos where there's also some content. And yeah, I think that this is great. We should definitely talk again.
Yeah, no, it'd be really good. And then I think that my wife is completely fascinated with Japan, and so we've been traveling over there a little bit. And the more I learn about the history of Japan, it feels like I need to start compiling a book on that too, because it's just so crazy. So whenever I get into that space, I'll definitely reach out. Maybe we could do a collaboration on this.
Oh, it'd be very cool. I mean, I think that the way that Japan sort of absorbed China's mechanisms and turned it into its own thing, and then became China a great adversary. I mean, it's a really interesting story. You want a little nugget about it right before we go?
Sure, yeah, bring it. Yeah.
Remember I was saying, I think we said earlier how China actually cut itself off from the sea around in the 1300s. It's called the Sea Bands. It was a major period in China's history, the start of the Ming Dynasty. Well, when Japan did its Sakoku, it had the same thing where it shut itself off from the world for 200 years, starting in the 1600s. It was actually using the exact same policies that China had used earlier on. And it was going through a similar period of trying to get real political consolidation, deal with the different areas of the mainland, bring it all together. And then when it became powerful, it was ready to push itself out. So it was a very interesting sort of nugget. Then when I first learned that, I was like, wow, that's just amazing. And then here it is, like, fighting China, really 50 years after it really kind of put everything together. Is pretty amazing.
Yeah, man, it just made me think of Baudrillard again. He talks about potentialization and how it has sort of a murderous vitality, and that if you sort of implode it or you push it, you repress it for a period of time, then there ends up becoming not only an explosion but also an implosion, and how it sort of ruptures on both ends until it disperses. And so it is kind of fascinating to think about both of these countries sort of like exploding out onto the world, and at the same time having these implosive issues, but dispersing their culture everywhere. And we didn't get into that too far, but and
being so close together, like right next to each other.
Yes,
it's like it really just like in the U.S. Imagine if, like, off the coast of California, you had like a country like Germany just like dangling as an island. It'd be like it's a very different thing. It's a very different world. We really have a completely different perspective on the world, just being out here in North America, free seas, free everything, like kind of looking at it. It's very cool, very different.
Yes, it is. Well, Jason, it's been fantastic. Thanks a bunch for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you for tuning in. I highly recommend Jason's Battlefield Hong Kong episode. Once again, his podcast is China Unraveled. So if you're interested in the direction China seems to be moving, take a listen. As usual, if you enjoyed the show or you have some insights for us, please let us know at letusthinkaboutit.com. Until next time, stay safe.